It was a cold, foggy night in the city of Blackwood. The streets were empty, and the only sound was the distant ticking of a clock tower. Detective Arthur Blake sat in his dimly lit office, staring at a pile of unsolved case files. His pipe smoldered on the desk, filling the room with a faint, sweet scent. He was about to call it a night when the door creaked open. A woman stepped in, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. She wore a long black coat, and her hands trembled as she clutched a small, leather-bound diary. "Detective Blake," she whispered, "I need your help." "My husband, he's gone." Blake gestured for her to sit. "Start from the beginning, Mrs. Carter." "Evelyn Carter," she said, sinking into the chair. "My husband, Richard, disappeared 3 days ago. He left for work as usual, but he never came home. The police say there's no evidence of foul play, but I know something is wrong. He wouldn't just leave me." Blake leaned forward, his sharp eyes studying her. "Did your husband have any enemies? Any unusual behavior before he disappeared?" Evelyn hesitated, then opened the diary. "This was in his study. I found it hidden in a drawer. It's filled with strange notes and codes. I think he was involved in something dangerous." Blake took the diary and flipped through the pages. It was filled with cryptic symbols, dates, and names. One name stood out: Victor Graves. "Who is Victor Graves?" Blake asked. Evelyn's face turned even paler. "He's a wealthy businessman. Richard used to work for him, but they had a falling out. Richard never told me why, but he was terrified of him." Blake closed the diary. "I'll look into it. Where can I find Graves?" "He lives in the old mansion on the hill," Evelyn said. "But please be careful. They say he's a dangerous man." The next morning, Blake arrived at the Graves mansion. It was a massive Gothic structure, surrounded by tall iron gates. The air was thick with the scent of decaying leaves, and the windows seemed to stare at him like dark, empty eyes. A butler answered the door, his expression cold and unwelcoming. "Mr. Graves is not receiving visitors." Blake flashed his badge. "This isn't a social call. Tell him Detective Blake is here to ask about Richard Carter." The butler hesitated, then stepped aside. "Wait here." Minutes later, Blake was led into a grand study. Victor Graves sat behind a mahogany desk, his sharp features framed by the glow of a fireplace. He looked up as Blake entered, his eyes narrowing. "Detective Blake," Graves said, his voice smooth but icy. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I'm investigating the disappearance of Richard Carter," Blake said, watching Graves closely. "I understand he used to work for you." Graves leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Richard was a talented man, but he had unfortunate habits. I had to let him go. As for his disappearance, I know nothing about it." Blake placed the diary on the desk. "Does this mean anything to you?" Graves' smile faded. He opened the diary and flipped through the pages, his expression darkening. "Where did you get this?" "It belongs to Richard," Blake said. "I was hoping you could explain its contents." Graves closed the diary and pushed it back toward Blake. "I'm afraid I can't help you, Detective. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have business to attend to." Blake knew he was being dismissed, but he wasn't ready to leave. "One more question. Where were you 3 nights ago?" Graves' eyes flashed with anger. "I was here, as I always am. Now, get out." Back in his office, Blake studied the diary again. The codes were complex, but he managed to decipher a few lines. They mentioned a meeting at the docks and a shipment of black roses. That night, Blake went to the docks. The fog was thicker than ever, and the sound of waves crashing against the piers echoed through the silence. He found an abandoned warehouse with a faint light glowing inside. Cautiously, he entered. The warehouse was filled with crates, and in the center of the room stood Victor Graves, talking to a group of men. "The shipment leaves at dawn," Graves said. "Make sure there are no mistakes." Blake stepped out of the shadows. "What kind of shipment, Graves?" Graves turned, his face twisted with rage. How dare you follow me?" "I'm here to find Richard Carter," Blake said. "Where is he?" Graves laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Richard was a fool. He thought he could expose me, but he paid the price." Blake's hand moved to his gun. "What did you do to him?" Before Graves could answer, one of the men lunged at Blake. A fight broke out, and in the chaos, Blake managed to knock out two of the men. But Graves was already running toward the door. Blake chased him outside, but Graves disappeared into the fog. As Blake searched the area, he found a small, hidden room beneath the warehouse. Inside was Richard Carter's body, slumped in a chair. Blake's heart sank. He had been too late. The next day, Blake returned to Evelyn Carter's home. He handed her the diary and told her the truth about her husband's death. "Graves is a dangerous man," Blake said, "but I won't stop until he's brought to justice." Evelyn nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Detective. Richard always said you were the best." As Blake left her house, he knew the case was far from over. Victor Graves was still out there. But for now, the city of Blackwood could sleep a little easier, knowing that Detective Arthur Blake was on the case.